Rosha, good morning.
Good morning, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I was saying, I didn't see any of my regions up there.
Over the course of the meeting, my notebook gets worse and worse.
We'll call the October 11, 2019 Audit and Compliance Committee to order. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So before we begin today, first order of business is in conversation with the folks supporting the committee, who run the committee, in all intents and purposes. We're looking at reordering today's agenda. I think I will just do that by chair's prerogative, subject to concerns by any member of the committee. The proposed order would be to go 2, 3, 1, 4, as items are listed on the agenda in front of us. Does anybody have an objection to making that reordering from the posted agenda? Hearing no concerns, that is what we will do. And before we launch into this, I think, very good schedule for today, I would like to turn it over to President Gable for some comments about a couple of the items that will be before us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Just a couple of opening remarks for the benefit of those in attendance. With regard to what is now item 1, enterprise risk review, just wanted to remind members of the board and our student representatives and anyone in the audience that this presentation was requested some time ago, but also comes as we're assessing our public safety and enterprise risk structures and processes. Last time I mentioned at the last board meeting that I've asked Senior Vice President Brian Burnett and his team to review policies and procedures, organizational structure, best practices, and in the beginning, current Twin Cities campus and University of Minnesota system coordination, as well as other recommended improvements, and then to report back in January. So as we will hear about actually a couple of times today, some things are happening as requested and some things are part of an overall march towards a completed strategic plan. And I would put this presentation as part of that. It's happening now, but has a flavor that will evolve and we will hear more about later. Similarly, in what is now item 2, the University Ethics Program and Values Update, Boyd Kumar will be presenting on work that he's been doing over the course of a couple of years, so obviously predating and as part of the transition coming to fruition now and describing the context in which that happens. But I think you'll all see that as he presents, there are attributes of what he's presenting that are likely to fold into a future strategic planning conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Gable. We'll move into the first item, enterprise risk review. This is a discussion item, and I would call on Provost Karen Hansen and Senior Vice President Brian Burnett. Please come up, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Rosha, members of the committee, President Gable. The two of us have been asked to provide a review of the enterprise risk work done by the board and the administration over the past several years. We're going to speak to reputational risk and the umbrella nature of that risk and its relation to other institutional risks. And we're going to participate with you and President Gable in a discussion of the processes related to risk mitigation. Thanks. Looking back over the past several years, really over nearly a decade, we see a summary on this slide that the board and the administration have steadily paid significant attention to the matters of institutional risk. The board expressed support for strategic risk management work groups, operational strategy and risk principles at its February 2011 meeting. The strategy and those principles provided the framework that was produced in 2014 that guided conversations of this committee as they reviewed and discussed the risks associated with major operational components of the university. The Audit and Compliance Committee held a 5-part series in 2017-18 on institutional risk and mitigation plans for each of these risks, and it began to move away from the heat map approach. And then last year, the committee did a deep dive into a few of the institutional risks and had a discussion about compliance risk as well, and of course that went on also at yesterday's mission committee. So, this very busy slide, which I don't know whether you can read or not, includes the 21 institutional risks agreed upon by the board in June 2018. And as you can see, the identified risks are divided into 3 categories: business challenge, compliance, and institutional integrity. You'll note that 3 of the risks are in 2 categories. International activities and legal and regulatory compliance are in both the business challenge and compliance categories, and intercollegiate athletics is in both the business challenge and institutional integrity categories. For each of these risks, the administration developed a 1-page risk mitigation plan in which the risk owners, as we call them, answered 2 questions. Why is this a risk, and how are you mitigating the risk? We're pleased with the outcome of that exercise and believe the resulting mitigation plans do get at the core, and this also help everyone understand each risk, and then understanding them, the risks, they help give a guide to how to avoid the risks. They provide clarity about how we actually do work to provide mitigation. So I think it's the next slide, and that's you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. As we look at the 21 risks, it is clear that 2 of them involve the active management of reputational risk, brand and reputation management, and crisis management. I think we'd all agree that these risks come into play when another of the institutional risks has manifested itself, and we kind of touched on that a little bit yesterday in the finance and operations. Like any risk, it requires prompt action by the university. They require and involve 1, a prompt assessment of an emerging situation. 2, we need a quick identification of the individuals that need to be at the table to respond. And 3, an agreement from those at the table on the appropriate decision makers and the actions to be taken. An example of the types of things that need to be in place to assure that we are ready to address a risk incident is spelled out in NIMS, or the National Incident Management System, utilized by the university's emergency management team. NIMS is how the city of Minneapolis or the state of Minnesota, all agencies train in NIMS so that we can work together seamlessly when you're working across agencies to respond. It involves preparedness, communications, resource management, command, and ongoing management and maintenance of the assets or the community. So those are one example of how we mitigate risk with respect to immediate crises.
Well, again, as Brian said, risk mitigation involves agility, and so regardless of the risk process or the system of oversight and mitigation that's involved in a particular risk, a group of people get together, a group of senior leaders that need to address, who are appropriate to the category of the risk, to address the mitigation, and that group of senior leaders may differ. For example, if you have a faculty member accused of research misconduct, it will involve the vice president for research, me, the general counsel, and the vice president for public relations, because these things are often public. If it's in athletics and a coach is involved in recruiting infractions, that'll be the director of athletics, excuse me, the general counsel, and again, the VP for university relations, because those are, again, often of public interest. So if there's, a staff accused of sexual misconduct, say not a faculty member, but a staff member, it certainly involves the vice president for equity and diversity, the general counsel, and the vice president for human resources. If it's a faculty member, it again also would involve my office. And financial misconduct discovered in a unit, that would be Brian's bailiwick, and the provost if it's a college that's involved, and the vice president for the health sciences if it's something clinical, the vice president for research if it's in sponsored funds or some, so it varies according to who has responsibility for those areas where the misconduct is occurring. So though there is the people in the offices may differ in any of these cases, there's always a need for some institutional point person who has responsibility in that area, who identifies the appropriate set of people to come together, senior leaders, and with that group has the responsibility to develop a plan and identify the resources needed to move the mitigation forward. And then that group is typically always consulting with university relations and developing a communications plan about what has happened and how the risk is being mitigated. And those communications are both internal and external.
I think we got catching up there. So currently, the point person is distributed among numerous senior leaders as owners of the risks. As the provost noted, there's a number of owners of the different risks listed. President Gable believes, and we agree, that a more centralized approach would provide senior leaders acting as the point person a more consistent guide as we tackle and mitigate risk. And as the president noted in our opening comments, we are going to be continuing to refine this over the next several months to be a little more deliberate about how that works together, especially given some of the things we've faced over the last few months, if not more than a few months. So with that, Chair Rocha, members of the committee, Provost and I are happy to take any questions about how we're working through looking at risk management for the university.
Thank you very much. We have some time for a conversation about this, questions and comments. I would open the floor. In the absence of an immediate signal from anyone, that wasn't immediate enough, Regent Hsu, I'm going to ask a question. Quicker on the draw on a Friday. Could you explain for the folks at this table, I'll try to pretend like I know the answer. What do you mean by the heat map approach?
The what?
The heat, you said we moved away from the heat map approach to these matters. What does that approach look like?
We used to kind of have something that, didn't sort of take each of these separately, but tried to suggest which of the areas, kind of was the most compelling. But any of these areas could be, a compelling either institutional, business, or reputational risk. And we really just thought we should focus on each individually and get clear about how we identify such a risk and what we do when it arises.
Very good, thank you. All right, Regent Hsu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I think this is a fine presentation. Appreciate the emphasis on the things that we do after something happens, but I always think that, well, how could we avoid these things? And, after one thing, you think, oh, everyone's going to be more accountable and more cognizant of what's going on. And we're not going to have another one of these come up anytime soon. But it's one thing after another, typically, around here. And I'm just wondering what we can do in terms of making sure that our people are more accountable to whether it's policies or laws or whatever, so that we can avoid, spend more time on the prevention by avoidance and essentially kind of change the way that people are kind of doing business generally. Because I think a lot of people do stuff and they know that they're doing stuff that's not right because we find out that it's been going on for a long time. So how do we... And I understand that once someone's kind of been doing something wrong, it's kind of hard to get them to change because they don't want anyone to know that they've been doing something wrong for a long time. So how do we get to that point where we no longer have those kinds of problems?
Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Hsu, I think we have to look at the proactive measures we've done and continue to look at doing, because you're right, it isn't just about reaction. It is about being proactive. And I guess one example I would give the committee is our work on the President's initiative to prevent sexual misconduct. Right, given what's gone on around the country and the reputational and financial hits that two of our peers have taken, I think, moved to a best practice where we've, first time, to my knowledge, in university history, we had mandatory training for all 26,000 employees. First time. And you know what? We got it done in part because we gave reports to managers and senior leaders about who was done and who wasn't done. My point is, it is about holding people accountable. And we got that done. We got 100% compliance by holding people accountable. Secondly, as I think we've explained here at this committee before, or maybe at litigation review, we've added layers of insurance coverage to the university that weren't here 2, 3, 4 years ago. It's a difficult market right now worldwide to find layers of coverage around sexual misconduct and frankly, traumatic brain injury are the two that are tough to insure. But on top of our risk layers, we've added coverage. So to me, those are examples of us thinking about sexual misconduct and not just sitting back and hoping people do the right thing. It's actually being proactive. The third example would be this group has talked about cybersecurity. We now have cybersecurity insurance, which we didn't have 3 years ago. So I think if we can talk about any of these 21 risks and what are we doing, but it's also like training for coaches. It's mandatory training that Director Coyle and the other athletic directors have for their coaches about compliance with NCAA rules, which Jeremiah talked about earlier. So I think it's a matter of us looking at those risks, where are the biggest risks, and proactively managing them, not just sit back and being defensive or reactive after the fact.
Thank you. Provost Hanson?
Well, I think all of that is right, and I would just add that we try, as we bring people into the university, to talk about how to do all the things we do well. I mean, we have research, ethics training, and we have codes of conduct for students. We have codes of conduct for faculty members. And we do try, we're an educational institution, and we do try to educate the folks who are here. We're also a small city, and we sometimes can't guarantee that everyone will behave properly, but we do take a number of steps institutionally to kind of try to make sure everybody understands how processes are supposed to be carried out here. And I think the things that Brian mentioned are good examples of that.
Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Just a quick follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just thinking of some recent examples of things. I'm not going to mention or speak with any specificity, but I think it does hurt our brand when people look at us and something happens and they go, how's that person still working there? And it is difficult because we do get those questions from various people in the community about why is it that someone just gets their hand slapped and they go back to work and typically have the same job that they had before, whether it's teaching or administrative or something else. So I'm just saying, if we are actually going to be looking at our policies, we should look at whether or not we actually are following our policies and actually what the policies are in those specific examples.
Thank you, Regent Hsu. My sense is that kind of gets into the subjective conversation about how to address issues, and you can have multiple people involved and multiple perspectives on what the appropriate response is, but obviously the reputational effect of the decision is going to be part of that factor. I don't know if either of you have it. We have a couple other folks that would like to ask questions or make comments. If you want to respond to that, you certainly may, or else I'll move to the next person. We'll go to Regent Kenyanya.
Mr. Chair, I withdraw my question.
Thank you. We'll go to Student Representative DeMuth.
Chair Rocha and members of the board, presenters. So you mentioned moving towards this centralized system approach. Can you give us a little more information on what that looks like, how that potentially differs from what we're currently doing, and how we believe this will be more positive moving forward?
Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Student Representative DeMuth. We are just getting started with the President coming on board and a charge that she gave me within the last 60 days or so to actually review it. So what I will tell you is she's bringing a fresh look as the new president and her experience and her discipline, quite frankly, about how we think about organizing. So details to be shared as we come along, but we're just beginning that review now. The idea would be how can we be more coordinated and more systematic in our response to situations, whether they're weather related or public safety related. We've already made some changes. I'll give you one example. We have a very good decision tree on safe view notifications versus text view that was put in place before the school year started here on the Twin Cities campus. Now, each of the campuses do their own, but, and that was vetted with the president before we put it into effect, but we now have a series of decision trees that we didn't have before. And it's much more, takes subjectiveness out of the way for a lot of our folks when we have like a lieutenant in charge of this campus on a Saturday night, or a captain of the, the police chief's not here all the time to be able to make those decisions. So how do we make it simpler for them and more comfortable for them to make timely notification warnings or that type of thing, and how do we do that systematically? So that's one example of taking a fresh look at how we respond in a more systematic way.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, seeing no further questions or comments, and our time is consumed, we will thank the presenters. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to our second item, University Ethics Program and Values Update. This is also a discussion item. I would ask President Gable, you're on the list here. Would you like to just stay where you're at?
I'm happy to stay where I'm at.
All right, we'll leave you there, and we'll ask Chief Compliance Officer Boyd Coomer to come forward. Oh, it's already here.
Yeah, I am here, sir. I snuck in on you.
Again, the floor is all yours.
Thank
Please
you.
proceed
Thank you.
at your discretion.
Thank you, Regent Rocha, President Gable, and Regents of the Board. So it's my pleasure to be here today, as always. It's always an honor to be in front of this group. And today I'm going to provide you with updates from the Office of Institutional Compliance. I'm going to focus my conversation on the creation of an ethics program within the Office of Institutional Compliance. But I do want to say that I also provided you with a brief written report that I do biannually that provides information on the current status of the compliance program, as well as a summary of our U-report statistics, or our anonymous reporting line for the university. And I also provided you with the 2019 Institutional Conflict of Interest report to the board, which I do so every year at about this time. So please review these at your convenience, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now, or as always, anytime you have them. So adding an ethics program to the university's Office of Institutional Compliance. I've been in front of this board several times to talk about this topic, but some of you I know are new, and progress has been made since my last report anyway, so it's great. I'm going to actually provide a little bit of a level set. As President Gable mentioned, this is a project that has been going on now for several years. It's been in the works. So with that background, and it's going to be provided, then I'll share the process that was used and the progress to date. But going back to August 2015, President Kaler at the time had charged the chief auditor, the general counsel, and the president's chief of staff to assess the current status of our compliance program. There were some pending changes. The director of the compliance program at that time, I believe, had announced their planned retirement, and so it was just seen as a good opportunity to take a look at the program and see how well we were doing. What this group came back with was that that the compliance program was, in fact, seen as largely effective. They issued a report in May of 2016, the Institutional Compliance Function Review, but there were opportunities, as there always, as you would expect, should be, for improvement, and they broke those up into 6 categories that you can see here. And the second category is where the focus of my presentation today is. And so it was determined that, again, the program was largely effective, but that our university was an outlier among our peers in not having any formal institutional programming around ethics. And it was recommended by this group that the university should establish a new ethics program within the Office of Institutional Compliance and task that program with reinforcing an ethical culture in the institution. And some of the work that needed to be done was to further define the scope and core activities of that program as well. And then that should be the first task of the new Chief Compliance Officer, which I was fortunate enough to become that individual. And that position was also a recommendation of this report. So I came on board at the end of 2016. And after getting a footing in the office and tackling a few other issues that I felt needed to be aligned with my strategic thinking for the office, I jumped into the ethics program development. So in 2017, we developed a framework for the program, but this took a lot of effort. We really wanted to get this right. I didn't want to come in and have an ethics program in name only. I wanted it to be impactful and ultimately measurable as well. So internally, we had discussions with the president, the chair of the Audit and Compliance Committee of the Board of Regents, the general counsel, internal audit, chief of staff, and our Executive Oversight Compliance Committee, which is a group of senior leaders that very much looks like the president's cabinet plus a few individuals. Externally, and this was a very important set of conversations to have, we reached out to peer institutions through the Minnesota Chief Compliance Officer Network, which is a fantastic organization actually started by the University of Minnesota, where chief compliance officers from 25 of Minnesota's biggest and brightest organizations get together every other month and talk about what's pressing issues in compliance they're facing, how they're managing them. And many of those programs also have an ethics component to their program as well, so they are a great resource. The Big Ten Chief Compliance Officer Network, which all of the chief compliance officers in the Big Ten, we try to get together once a year, but we also have a listserv and frequent phone calls with each other. So another great network, and many of those institutions have ethics components to their compliance program. And then the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics, which you may or may not know, but is really a national leader in the topic of compliance and ethics, highly regarded by institutions such as the FBI, and also founded here in Minneapolis. Great resource, and they have a higher ed component, which gave me access to hundreds of chief compliance officers. And so information was gleaned from those sources. And in addition, we did a pretty intensive review of literature and documents. Our university archivist was a great help to us as well, but we took a deep dive into how the university has perceived values, principles, et cetera, over the many decades, and incorporated that into our thinking. And as well as both internal and external publications. So after all of that work, in March of 2018, I obtained a charge from the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee to establish a university's ethics program. So now we had some structure around this, and the elements to be implemented were to define ethics, because that was often a challenge for some institutions that had ethics programs, was the actual definition that they were using for ethics. And we landed on behaving in a manner consistent with our values. And then the charge also included identifying and defining 4 to 5 values to guide ethical decision-making and ethical behavior. And then promote these values through employee training, messaging, et cetera. And then as maybe you've gathered from my past presentations, I'm very big on assessing and monitoring. And so this is key. Now that if we have 4 to 5 values, we can assess and monitor our ethical culture around those values. And I do want to say that focusing on 4 to 5 values doesn't exclude you from the wonderful population of other ethical values that are out there as well. And then establish the Office of Institutional Compliance and Ethics as a university resource. And so actually holding ourselves out there as available, accessible to our campus population for things such as training and guidance on specific issues. So on identifying the values, and I'll pause maybe for a second because I feel like I'm just rolling through this. Any questions so far about the process?
Thank you. I'll turn to Regent Shu, I believe, has a question
I don't, yeah, thank you, Mr.
or a
Chair.
comment, apparently.
My concern with what I've seen so far, and maybe it'll change as we go through this presentation, but anytime that we discuss values here at the university, no one really knows what we're talking about because we can't point to one thing that says these are our values. And a lot of times we put out statements that say, these are, based on our values, but I read it and I say, well, I don't know what that means. And so I think the general public must read that and say, well, I don't know what that means. We can all assume kind of what our own personal values are and what we think the values of the university should be, but absent a list of actual values, and we've had that discussion. Regent Powell is not here today, but we've had this discussion quite a bit, and we actually, I thought, we're going to come up with actual list of values, and I don't think we've done that yet. So I'm just trying to say that based on what I've seen so far, I'm not even sure what the definition, your definition of ethics means, because it references values that we don't.
And I do think I'll answer that as we progress, but if we get at the end and I haven't, please let me know and I'll address that.
Thank you.
So the work began on identifying 4 to 5 values and to use to guide ethical decision-making, values-based decision-making. I'm not talking about core values. I'm talking very specific to the compliance and ethics program for the institution. So we consulted with the university stakeholders, including the Faculty Consultative Committee, the Dean's Council, student groups, staff groups, and also randomly surveyed over 3,100 campus community members, including faculty, staff, and students. So we are now wrapping up, or have wrapped up, our consultation phase. This information gleaned on what values we should use as an institution, focus on as an institution for values-based decision-making. All of that information was rolled up to the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee, which met just 2 days ago, to make a recommendation to President Gable. So essentially what we had was the beginning population of nearly infinite values that you could think of. And we had boiled it down to a much shorter list of what leadership or what the campus community says that we should focus on. So there were very encouraging things that came up, like accountability and integrity and respect. And those were put together in a summary shared with the Executive Oversight Compliance Committee that met on Wednesday, and a recommendation has been extended to President Gable as to what values should be used. And so I believe that we're with that, and that's pending at this time. In all fairness to President Gable, I just thought about this morning. She may not have seen it yet because it was via email, but so that's there. So. Flip slides. So to the question of values to use for ethical decision-making versus, I believe, what Regent Shu was talking about, which are institutional core values, the institution has identified in documents values, guiding principles, over the years. When this work started, initially, the thought is that this would be an effort to highlight or come up with a list of core values. However, as the work was undertaken and conversations were held with the board office, with leadership from this committee in the past, it was determined that the core values and the code of conduct, are really the purview of the Board of Regents. And so if there is going to be a statement of institutional core values and a work done to better define or clarify those, that should that's work that would be initiated by the Board of Regents. The work that needed to happen in order to have an effective compliance and ethics program and ethics component to the program is to set up or establish a short list of values that could then be applied to ethical decision-making scenarios. And this is actually what's seen as best practice, if you will, in this type of ethics program, is being able to train individuals, leaders, staff members on values-based decision-making. So when faced with an ethical decision, we have a list of values that we want you to filter those decisions through. So that may include acting with honesty, for example. So I'm just, we don't have that set list yet, but is the action that I'm going to take honest? Is it respectful? Is it transparent to the appropriate level? And so this type of training is considered essential to having an effective compliance and ethics program.
Thank you very much. President Gable, did you want to make some comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our presenter. So I was here yesterday, so I haven't caught all the way up with my email, and there is, in fact, a recommendation from the committee, and with the presenter's permission, I'll go ahead and articulate the values recommended by the committee, because I think there would be helpful for discussion purposes, and I don't see any reason to wait, given that these recommendations were prepared through a very broad set of consultative efforts and then might be fruitful for the discussion, with the proviso that these values are not intended or recommended to this for this review as adoption as core values, at least not yet, but at this point are intended to be part of the framework for when there are conflicts of interest on campus, that there is a rubric for decision-making. Now, this could be a starting point for a discussion about the board's adoption of core values, because they were prepared consultatively as a next step, which is what I was referring to earlier. So these values are accountability in the context of obligation and willingness to accept responsibility for actions and behaviors, integrity in the context of acting with honesty and consistency, transparency in the context of acting with honesty and openness, respect, referring to due regard for the well-being and rights of individuals in the university, and stewardship, careful and responsible management of university resources. This is a synthesis of what came through the consultative process to offer an ethical framework for conflicts of interest for the university. And that is the rubric with which they are presented today.
Thank you, President Gable. We've got some interest in having a conversation here at Regents. Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to first apologize because I'm going to take us way back to ground zero, I think, here. I am not as versed as I ought to be, Boyd, in the process we're going through.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Kumar, I believe very strongly we have to protect our brand. I believe very strongly that people have to act ethically. I always used to speak to groups, mostly at the Capitol, mostly employees or state employees, and say, you do the right thing, you do it the right way, you do it all the time. Now, I failed at that, and I'm sure all of us fail at that at certain times. I just have a question to begin with here regarding the creation of the OICE, is it?
The Office of Institutional Compliance. Yes, yes, sir.
I'm conflicted because I worry about always the increase of administrative costs, administrative burden here at the university, far more so than other public institutions. Go ahead, maybe you can answer my question before I get to it.
I don't know, sir, but Chair Rocha, Regent Swigum, I hope that we keep the OIC because it has been established for 7 years, and is in place. Our current effort has not requested or even implied a request for additional staff at this time. The work that we've done with existing resources and just a new chief compliance officer's enthusiasm and energy, I would say.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I should have, but I didn't. But as I read here, it says, establish the Office of Institutional Compliance and Ethics as a resource. It seems like we're creating it. It seems like we're enhancing it. That's the way it reads to me.
Yes, sir. And if I may, sir, it would just be the addition of the word ethics to the title of the existing office to clarify that it was both a compliance and ethics program and not just a compliance
Okay, that
program.
clarifies it a little bit. I will pass on the rest of my question, but I just didn't want us to get into such burdensome bureaucratic increase in administrative personnel and costs that we just forget if people just try to do the right thing the right way and do it all the time. We probably don't need to create new committees and new compliance efforts, but I'll pass for now, just simply because I don't know where we're going, but.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. You know, and this, it does raise a question, and this is sort of a, you know, kind of an approach question. When we have different vice presidents, you have vice president of equity and diversity, and you have these, now you have an office of compliance and ethics, you know, and sort of, for me, it's a reframing, because in the past, that's everyone's responsibility. Every unit has a responsibility for, you know, removing barriers to diversity and ensuring inclusiveness and so on. Everybody has an obligation, and sometimes I feel like you create these little fiefdoms that it's not really intended to remove that obligation from anybody else, but, you know, for an organization of this size, I think you end up with that kind of a focus, but I do think that it can be done to a point where, you know, when you're taking resources away from other functions, you know, you got to just always confirm that you're getting that value. And I think that's a fair question that you raised, Regent Swigum. And to the extent that we can maybe look into that a little bit and provide Regent Swigum and the rest of the committee some clarity on what the investments are, and kind of sort of a zero-based budgeting conversation as to why we're doing this the way we are. Regent Swigum, good question. Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. As you were speaking, you said a really good point that it's everyone's responsibility, you know, which got me thinking it's already happening, you know, in some way, in some places. I imagine there's a chancellor or dean or whatever listening and saying, wait a minute, we already have some procedure, some document, something. So I guess my question is, how are we sourcing and then incorporating what units across the system are already doing along this, and making sure that that's being rolled up rather than kind of going down? And I know, you know, you list out all the groups you consulted with for values, so I know that's part of it. And then to what extent is this consultation system-wide? So kind of two questions there.
Okay, well, thank you, Chair Rocha and Vice Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. So I don't know if I'll be able to answer those questions consecutively as they were asked, but I'll try to hit them all. I think the inclusiveness of the process with consulting pulled a lot of that in. We looked for this type of feedback in meeting with the Dean's Council, survey group, with just the many dozens, if not hundreds of conversations I've had over the past couple of years on this topic. We've tried to be inclusive of all of the work that is happening out there. But we would often run into the same question, actually, that Regent Hsu has brought up, is what document or where do I go in the institution to find a set? So our other campuses, other than the Twin Cities, some have statements of core values, and those were very helpful and in helping frame the discussion. And if I may, and I don't want to digress on this, but one very interesting fact that I learned, or concept, if you will, that I learned as we went through this is when you think of values, and this was from the chair of our ethics, academic ethics program at the university, shared this knowledge with me. When you think of values, it's maybe helpful if you think of like 3 categories of values. One is virtues, and virtues are things like courage. And often you have courage or you don't, but there's virtues on one end. On the other end, there are values that are ideals. So there are many things that we hold out there that we're aspiring for. It's a value, and we want to get there, and it's an ideal. And then in the middle, in the middle may be my layman's way of thinking about this, but you have a group of values that are more like constraints, and they're what you filter your work as you go through. So core values are great and may be reflective of some of these constraints, but they not all core values fit this type of work ideally. So if our value, our ideal is, say, academic excellence, and or research excellence, the work that we do to get there should be filtered through our values, right? So it should be, we're going to act with transparency. We are going to work with honesty and integrity or accountability. Those are the constraints that we put on ourselves to make sure that when we get to our ideal, we've done it in a way that is aligned with our values.
Thank you, Mr. Coomer.
I'm sorry.
I apologize. This is the chair's fault. We're running up against a time issue, and I've got a student representative. Kraft would like to ask a question or make a comment. My sense is that that you were maybe asking a little more of a directed question, kind of an operational thing. What I think we can maybe do is I'll work with the vice chair. I'm very interested in that answer as well, how this has incorporated kind of existing processes and procedures, and then we can get those questions to you. I just apologize, we're just up against the clock here.
I'm sorry, sir. Thank you.
No apology necessary. Mr. Student Representative Kraft, the floor is yours. And we may be in the same situation where if you've got a question, we may have to come back to us with the answer, but I'll turn it to you now.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Rocha, and Chief Compliance Officer Coomer, members of the board. My area of interest with this question for future consideration is also in line with Regent Kenyana's and Chair Rocha's remarks regarding scope and where this work fits into campus discussions and system-wide discussions, both in terms of consultation as well as implementation moving forward. So for future consideration as time allows. And then a very quick question in discussing consultation, could you just clarify, was the list of consultants there, I would lean towards it not being exhaustive. Could you just clarify that was not an exhaustive list of the consultants provided on the slide?
I would say that was not an exhaustive list. So, is there a particular?
Particularly with relation to students, seeing that there were consultative bodies for faculty and staff as well, and that such bodies exist for students.
Yeah, and we've reached out to many of those groups. Yes.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and we can again explore that a little bit. I take this as the great compliment that it is for your area of expertise and the work of your office, that there is this kind of interest, because I think we could probably go on for some time. I'm interested in particular what kind of obligations we're considering as far as third parties having obligations to help enforce. You know, as a member of the bar, you have obligation to report violations that are committed by third parties, for instance. In the military, you have an obligation to report things that are happening, and I'm interested in where we are in that, but we won't have time to respond to that. But we'll either have to get you back on into the batter's box here, or have other kinds of communication. So thank you very much, Mr. Coomer.
All right.
We will quickly move on. We're taking off late, but we'll make up the time in the air.
We will.
Turn it over. We'll turn it over to Chief Auditor Klatt for item 3, internal audit update for discussion.
All right. The docket material for this item starts on page 4, so back up. A couple specific items of note. The Office of Internal Audit will be undergoing its 5-year external quality assurance review. We're in the process of doing the required self-assessment at this point in time. We expect a group of external reviewers to complete the external part of that review, maybe in January, if I can get people to agree to come to Minnesota in January for fun and work. But that's our anticipated time period. My goal is to have that external review done and results being able to be reported to this committee at its February meeting. We will be compiling our self-assessment report, and that report will also be provided probably in the interim between meetings to the committee members for your pleasure reading. As part of that quality assessment review, you as members of the audit committee will be receiving a survey, and we delayed that survey to give the many new members of this committee at least a little bit more time of interacting with the audit function in order for you to feel comfortable providing whatever input you might have. And you will probably receive that within the next week or so. And we really appreciate your participation in this process, which is really important for us. Second, the Office of Internal Audit will celebrate its 90th anniversary in November. 1929, it was a big year. And the University Board of Regents, in its wisdom, determined that perhaps some audit oversight would be appropriate and developed the office at that time of one. But actually, in relative terms, I was not, but I did think about that I have been here for, a good amount of that, 90 years, so I don't know, I have to think about that. So anyway, just wanted to offer that as a little historical thing. All right, our follow-up work for this period of time, the results are noted on page 6 and 7 of your docket material. Our overall implementation rate was 38%, which is a little under 40, which is our goal. If we hit 40% every reporting period, that means that like 95% of audit recommendations are implemented within 6 months, which we think is pretty reasonable. So we're at 38, so a little bit of a drop, but nothing that I'm overly concerned about. We have one unit, Intercollegiate Athletics, who has audit recommendation outstanding more than 2 years, and that has to do with the recommendation to improve their electronic medical records for athletes' medical information and appropriate controls over the privacy of that. Their plan, which we thought was wise, was to move to Epic, which is the medical record system used by the University of Minnesota physicians. They had to wait for some contracting to happen between Fairview and UMP in order to be able to get access to that system. They now have it, they're training their folks, but not everyone is through it, so it's not fully implemented, but well on their way, and it will be a significant improvement for them. On page 8 of the docket material, we have a couple items this time where the administration is accepting a certain level of risk. They have taken action on particular items, but have not taken all the action that we recommended, so there's some residual risk left. They are comfortable accepting those risks, and our obligation is to report that to you. I don't have any professional concerns about the risks that are remaining, so that's that. On beginning on page 21 is the summary of audit work that was completed during this period. We completed 11 audits and have 7 that are currently in process. And I'd just like to point out a couple of the audits to the committee. On page 22, there's a summary of our audit of hospitality expenses. And this was an interesting review when we actually identified hospitality expenses to review individually. We found very good compliance with university policy. What we did find, however, is it's very hard to identify those items without doing really and truly a document by document review, which is very time intensive. So it would be nearly impossible for President Gable to ask the question and receive an answer of how much do we spend on hospitality expenses? And that's not an uncommon question somebody might ask. It's one of our most discretionary type of expenses that can be expanded or contracted as needed. And so it would be very hard to do any trending about are we spending more, are we spending less, et cetera. And so it really is a function of how our general ledger system is used. And so as a result of that audit, we posed the question that the administration should assess if that's a valuable piece of information it would want to obtain, and if so, it needs to do some modification to make that information available. And so they're working on that. So just so that you understand, it was kind of a mixed thing. Good news is when we looked at the actual transactions that were hospitality, that we determined the compliance was fine. We just can't tell you how much we have of it. We completed a third audit of our audits of verifying action taken on the Advancing Human Research Protection implementation plan. That's our third and final. We have gone through the entire plan and verified what the status of those steps are. We also completed a related audit involving the Department of Psychiatry, which was very much involved in that set of circumstances, and both had very good results. We did identify that we don't currently have a governance process for making changes to that implementation plan, which was very publicly disseminated. And I have made a recommendation to President Gable, which he is acting on, to ask such a process to be established. And then, because I know you all are so interested, we did do a compliance audit in football operations, and the results were really quite outstanding. If you reviewed the actual audit report, you would see that our scope of work was very broad. We did interviews with student athletes, and with coaches. We found a very high level of training and awareness of NCAA compliance requirements and obligations by both coaches and athletes. And really, it had the fewest audit findings of a sports audit that we have done for many, many, many years. So it was really quite a notable accomplishment on the part of the football program. And with that, I will open for any questions that you might have on any of the audits or any of our work or whatever your concern of the day is.
Thank you, Auditor Klatt. We are in overtime right now. I had Regent Shu. Do you have an ever so brief?
I will pass.
And Regent Svigum.
Brief.
Yes, please.
One of our snap audits had to do with the leave, the excuse me leave.
Yep.
And it seemed to me to be of concern, of real concern, that you sampled 25 persons, I think, and the total unexcused expenses or inappropriate expenses were like $200,000.
Yes.
You multiply that by the number of employees it could have been, you got to multiply by 100. We could be talking millions of dollars.
Auditor Klatt.
Thank you, Chair Rocha and Regent Svigum. I'm not sure I could appropriately extrapolate our sample to that
I
population.
can't extrapolate that.
Right, just
But if I
because
did,
of the
then
sampling.
25 to
Absolutely.
2,900.
Yeah, it's
We're
a,
talking some real money.
yeah, it's eye-catching. But I don't, we would have to do more work, and we will do more work too, and we have shared these results with our HR area. But we actually talked about that as we got our results. Our sampling methodology in this particular case just does not lend itself to extrapolation.
Okay.
It wasn't done in that methodology, but.
I feel more
your
comfortable
point-
when you can't extrapolate it, but
Right.
Mr. Chairman, I think we need to look into that a little bit further.
Regent Sviggum, that's a very good point, and we'll follow up and understand. I want to understand when a sample set can be extrapolated and when it can't. And so we can talk about that. We'll take the information items in your docket under review. I want just a couple points to your friendly company commander role in saying that you're not concerned about 38 versus 40. I'll be the grumpy first sergeant and say, I'm concerned. I want to make sure that we're always, beating the standard, and I don't want to make it sound like that, we're comfortable falling. We want to be there and better. Second, in our conversation with the Foundation Audit Committee, a point that I was asked to relay to our board is just to ensure that when there are issues that come up of compliance or ethics or otherwise, the standard you set for the high performer is the standard you set for all performers. And so we want to make sure that we're establishing that, and that is fair. And then finally, there was an inquiry by a member of the board about seeking a specific audit, an audit of a specific area, and we're just now navigating through. Out of respect for that request, I want to say that we're looking at how we do that because we've approved a work plan for the year, and so working with Auditor Klatt, we're trying to incorporate that and understand how we'll bring that back to this committee to ensure that those kinds of very reasonable requests are things that we can support, but recognizing we have limited resources within audit, so to add something you may have to postpone something, and so we're in that process right now. Are there any further pressing matters before this committee?
Just the expectation of cake for the 90th celebration.
There may be some.
We will have a 3-layer ethical cake. Seeing no further matters before this board is, Student Representative Kraft.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Rocha. Very brief, just a comment on one of the information items on U-report statistics, maybe a conversation to happen at a later time, but seeing that over 83% of the U-report reviews came in as unsubstantiated, I would just hope that there's discussion moving forward on knowledge of this resource and how to properly use this resource. It just seems like a concerning number for usage of a tool for reporting law and policy violations, making sure that it's a resource appropriately used moving forward.
That's a great catch, and I think that may be something we could put forward for, obviously when we put these agendas together, maybe questions will arise, maybe they won't, and obviously it's sometimes hard to do to understand how long they'll take, but that would be, I think, for this committee and its new construction, that may be a good conversation for us to have. Thank you for raising that. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.